I'm Liz Hyman. I'm the president and CEO of the XR Association and thrilled to be back at AWE. I thought the opening keynotes this morning were fantastic, really on point and illustrative of some of the things that we're going to talk about. Before we get underway, though, I always, look, I'm from Washington, D.C., shudder, it's a scary thing. But in fact, there is a really interesting and good group of members of Congress in the House and Senate and executive agencies all throughout the government that are supporters and are really engaging and doubling down using this technology. And in fact, before we get underway, I had a really short video that I just wanted to share with everyone. So if we can go ahead and run that, and then we'll get underway with our panel.
Hello, I'm Congressman Ted Lieu from Southern California. I want to congratulate all the organizers of the Augmented World Expo. As a recovering computer science major, I want to commend all the participants who are driving innovation in the immersive future. While I can't be with you in person today, I'm honored to share this brief message with such a dynamic and forward-thinking community. Having had the privilege of experiencing XR firsthand, I'm continually impressed with its potential. From virtual reality to smart glasses and digital twins, immersive technologies are poised to transform how we learn, communicate, play, and interact. The possibilities are as exciting as they are limitless, particularly as we see a convergence of XR with artificial intelligence. That's why I'm also honored to be a co-chair of the House Reality Caucus to ensure the U.S. leads in responsible innovation in XR. We can accomplish that by investing in research and development, coordinating public-private partnerships, and promoting policies that spur innovation while protecting Americans from harm. I look forward to working with all of you and the XR Association on securing a thriving XR sector in the United States.
He's very, very good, Ted. So I think that's a good start in terms of our discussion today, and particularly that last point about how government and the private sector can work together to help support and spur on our industry. And I just wanted to say a couple quick things before we get into the panel, which is we mentioned at the top in the intro that we've been reaching out to the current administration to figure out how, when they're talking about an AI strategy, XR is integrated into that. But we started some efforts a few years ago. We actually partnered with the George Washington University's Digital Data and Trade Hub to do a white paper called Reality Check. And the idea behind that paper was to look at what other nations are doing, whether it's China or the European Union, the UK, other nations, and how governments are taking sort of a very holistic and intentional view towards supporting their XR industry. And from there, we said, well, maybe we need to do the same thing here in the United States. And so we worked with members of Congress to craft some legislation called the U.S. Leadership and Immersive Technology Act. And it was introduced at the end of 2024, and then that congressional session came to an end. So we reintroduced it, got it reintroduced in the beginning of 2025. And essentially what that legislation proposes to do is to set up an advisory body within the Department of Commerce that includes all the executive agencies, plus industry, plus academia, to advise the president and to come up with a strategic approach from the U.S. government on how we support and build this technology. And we think it's very much high time that we get to, moving that type of an effort forward. So today, as we get into this conversation, we're going to talk a little bit about the bill, the legislation, and what we can do as an industry to support those efforts. So what I'd like to do first is just ask everyone to briefly introduce themselves. So I'm going to start with Jeremy, and then we'll just go down the line.
Great. Hi, everybody. My name is Jeremy Luby. I'm with Chocolate Milk and Donuts. We are an XR implementation firm. So we work with education and enterprise organizations to help them scale their pilot programs to platforms.
Great. Kristi?
Kristi Woolsey. I am the global lead for XR for BCG, which is one of the big four consultancies. And what I do is I work with our Fortune 100 companies who know this is coming but aren't quite sure, are we giving that to our customers? Are we going to like enable our employees? Like what should we do with emerging technology, and what is the roadmap to get there?
Yeah, thanks. My name's Andres Castrillon. I'm Senior Director of Government Affairs with Qualcomm. Qualcomm, as I hope you know, is the chipset provider of choice for the entire XR ecosystem. But I'm not an engineer. I'm a lawyer by training and a government affairs professional. So I am the US policy lead for Qualcomm on artificial intelligence, automotive technologies, and then other emerging technologies, including XR. So I sit in Washington, DC. I interface with policymakers, Capitol Hill, the administration, the agencies, making sure that Qualcomm's leadership is aware of policy proposals and regulatory proposals, and planning those into our product roadmap. But even more importantly, making sure that as policymakers propose different policies, that they're aware of Qualcomm's priorities, objectives, and making sure that there's synergy there between the public sector and the private sector.
Great. And so that's a pretty good jumping off point, Andres, and I was wondering if I could come to you first. I mentioned the reality check white paper.
Yeah.
And really what we were trying to do with that was to explain what's at stake here.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you might be able to, particularly given Qualcomm's position, articulate that.
Yeah, so it was a really important initiative that you all kicked off, right? So this white paper essentially, what it found was that other countries, South Korea, the UK, the European Union, and China, have all designated immersive technologies as a national strategic priority. And then they've gone even further. They've created a national plan, a national strategic framework for things like research and development and the deployment of that technology in different industries, right? And what they found was that while the United States is obviously a leader in the creation, the development of this technology, we don't have anything similar, which gets to your question, Liz. So what's at stake? I think what's at stake is that the United States would cede leadership in the development and the deployment of XR technology. And that's a really broad statement, so let's break that down. I think one of the first potential negative consequences is economic consequences, right? If these other countries have a national framework, not just for the development, but for the actual deployment of the technology across different industries and use cases, what that may mean is that the markets for immersive technologies in those countries grows faster than the market in the United States because we lack that strategic framework, right? So that's an economic consequence in terms of lost market share. It may also mean that the deployment, right, the uptick, the usage of that technology across these different use cases is slower in the United States than it is in other countries. And so the ecosystem that gets created globally may start to become centralized in other markets that are much more deliberate in developing and deploying the technology. Beyond the economic consequences, there's also consequences from a governance perspective, right? So the country that tends, or the countries that tend to have the largest ecosystems tend to have the most influence in things like standards and benchmarks, and just the general sort of values from an ethical perspective that become embedded in this technology as it gets deployed more broadly, right? And so we want to make sure as a country that we have a large ecosystem, that we're the center of that development, and that we're not ceding that leadership unintentionally, I think, right? Because the United States has identified immersive technologies as a strategic technology area. We just haven't followed up with that strategic framework, right? And so we've seen in other technology areas where if you're not proactive, you become reactive down the line, and then you try to claw back an ecosystem that's already developed somewhere else. Very difficult to do, right? If we consider this a race, we want to be at the front of the pack, or at least amongst the leaders, rather than trying to play catch up, 5 or 10 years down the line. The last thing I'll say, Liz, is that if you read the newspaper, you know that from a geopolitical perspective, leadership in technology is now seen as directly tied to sort of geopolitical influence and geopolitical strength, right? We're watching that play out in real time in the AI policy space. So if you believe, as I do, that XR technology is a strategic technology that's going to have transformational consequences for industries and for citizens, then I think we can all agree that our country should also have a national framework, a strategic plan for how to roll out and maintain a leadership position in this technology.
Yeah, that's a great answer, and it plays into a few things. So first of all, as an industry trade association representing this technology, we're in Washington. We're trying hard to adapt to the exigencies that we see on the ground there in order to support our industry. And this conversation around global competitiveness is huge. And so as we think about policies like this and what kind of arguments we want to make, are we trying to bring manufacturing back to the United States? Yes, we need workers that can do it, and we need technologies that will help with productivity, so on and so forth. So Kristi, I know BCG has done some really interesting work, you have, that is looking, for example, at this idea of competitiveness, but also the workforce behind it, right? And I love the phrase deskless worker. So I was wondering if you could define what that means for BCG and for everybody else, and then thinking about the work that you've done, the reports and studies, like what does that mean when we're talking about what's at stake and so on and so forth?
Yeah, I think I was gonna I was gonna jump in because a lot of our commercial clients, when we move this out into U.S.-based companies or other, they need to understand where is safe harbor, right? And we need policies to help them understand. And one of the things, one of the cases that we just finished in January was for SBB, Swiss Rail, for those who have taken trains in Europe, the most on-time train ever. They wanted to extend the life of their trains, and so they're basically taking them one at a time down to bare metal, right? But the problem is that they have 1 million PDFs with diagrams of all these different kinds of trains. And so what we did was we built a little AI engine and that would convert these PDFs into checklists, and then you could and then take diagrams that were associated with the various tasks, right? And so it's very AI driven, and yes, you can run it on a tablet. But one of the first use cases we put together was a use case for something that is incredibly annoying to those technicians, and it is so much easier to do it in a headset, right? So we did a very lightweight. You can pop the headset on. You can you single sign on. It knows it's you. The camera looks at the number on the train and knows that that's the train car and pulls up a message that says, you have 3 tasks to do on this train, and if you're an experienced person, you can click through the task list. If you're inexperienced, you can double click and get those diagrams, watch a video, even set up a Teams call. And of course, it is Swiss Rail. They have their own timekeepers, full-time job there. And they measured, and we ended up with 20% efficiency gains for an experienced worker and 27% for inexperienced, which is about $200 million over 5 years once the thing scales, right? And so what that means is that use case is catching so much attention from all of my clients, right? Because you go to anybody and you say, hey, you could save $200 million over 5 years, and they're like, where, how, like what, how, like, yes, please do that for me, right? But when I'm working in a U.S. context, the policies are not in place to begin to talk about how do I implement this in ways that are not going to get me in trouble down the line? And I am absolutely not advocating that somebody who knows nothing about XR goes away and writes a bunch of policy. The approach that the XRA has taken is to put out there, to put together industry, academic, experts that can begin to design and advise this. But it is, I am getting a lot of hesitation, like a lot of excitement, like they're ready to go there, but then when we get into the weeds, hesitation because is this a safe space? Can we go here? Are we going to get sued over this? Are we going to, that kind of
And Andres mentioned, that the United States is different from China, it's different from the EU, it's different from the UK, in the sense that ours is very much driven by the innovation and creativity of the private sector. We work very hard, I know the XRA does, on best practices and trying to come up with industry standards that are good for all of us, and to share that with government so that they know we're taking a responsible approach to the technology and finding ways in which the regulations that do exist merge together with the best practices that we are developing, so that we're thoughtful about these things. So, and that will create sort of that safe harbor that you're talking about, but we need to have a framework for those conversations, and that's really what we're trying to get at. But Jeremy, I mean, you're sitting down in Mexico, which I'm insanely jealous about, but your company is in Montana, right? Mm-hmm. And you're seeing sort of this governmental swath, right, that you engage with. And I'm curious, like, what does this all mean, to you and your clients and the business that you operate?
Yeah, it's really important for us that government starts to take a larger role and starts to pay attention to policy and strategy and really be able to put funding behind that. So at the moment, we're running the first statewide XR rollout in higher education. So getting to see this at a statewide level, we're touching 40 different educational departments, and this is not just about gaming anymore. And I think that's a really important thing that our government hasn't yet caught on to. And what that means is that XR has now become the interface of AI. We were just down in the expo hall earlier using XR to interact with AI. This is no longer the internet where everything is about a text prompt. I mean, yes, we can still do that on ChatGPT, but that is not the future and not what we're going to continue to do. And so if we are putting money and time and effort and policy into AI, recognizing that it is critical infrastructure, it's time that we need to start recognizing that XR is equally a part of that critical infrastructure program. And I'd really like to see them start putting some more money in it, especially into our education programs. When we have over 40 different educational departments in one state that are all using this, everything from mining safety to nursing to STEM programs. Again, I'll go back and say this isn't about gaming anymore.
Yeah.
It's really important we start stepping up.
Yeah.
And if I can just jump in on that, you had asked me to define deskless worker.
Yes.
which I did not do, because I'm just so excited about Chris Brown. We originally, we were struggling with the kind of white collar, blue collar, pink collar. We were struggling with all these names, and we're like, you know what? Where XR is really going to take off is with people who do not spend their working day with their hands on a keyboard, right? Because I spend my working day with hands on keyboard, so I can do that. And that includes, right? That includes teachers, right? It includes surgeons. It includes the technicians at Swiss Rail. It includes, so it really is, we have desk workers who have access to AI through kind of traditional means. And then there's like 60, 70% of the world that is deskless workers. This is not a minor number of people, right? And the only way that they are going to get access to AI in their work is through XR.
Yep.
And so we see this huge opportunity opening up in front of us.
You know, and that sort of tees up the next part of our conversation really nicely. I was struck by Ziad's presentation and the discussion about on-device AI computing, which will be a superpower for these deskless workers. And we kicked off the description of the panel with, hey, administration, we need to be part of any comprehensive AI proposal because we're that physical manifestation of the technology. So maybe, Andres, I wonder, you've been working with us to try to get the U.S. leadership bill moving, and how do you see some of these conversations playing out and explaining and leveraging what's happening?
So I think if you look at the AI policy space over the last 2 years, 2.5 years, ever since the introduction of ChatGPT, policymakers have been intensely focused on AI. I think the first 18 months they were worried about AI harms, right? And it was the policy discussion was all around who's creating the models, how are they creating them, what data are they using, and then how do we make sure that these models, these AI models, that people are going to interact with, how do we avoid unintended harms, right? And so the discussion has been very focused on models. More recently, the discussion has been focused around compute power. What's the level of compute power that you need to maintain your leadership in the development of AI foundation models, and sort of how do we make sure that US companies have enough compute power and that other adversaries or perceived adversaries don't. I think that the aperture of that policy conversation needs to broaden, and I think it's inevitably going to broaden to be about how are you and I, how are citizens on a day-to-day basis going to interact with AI? What are the different use cases? And then as we talk about global competitiveness, how do we leverage AI for US global competitiveness? And I think that discussion inevitably shines a light on XR. How does AI get out into the world? All morning was all about you can't have AI without XR. It's a symbiotic relationship. AI loves XR, loves AI back, right? And so we need to leverage that reality in the policy discussions. And this bill is part of that, right? The Leadership Act. It's getting the right folks at the table, government, academia, and industry, right? And trade associations, of course. And making sure that we have a coordinated discussion around not just AI, but I think that the discussion is going to need to be more focused and specific. And I think within that broader AI discussion, this technology, as you'll see when you walk around the room, has real transformational potential now, right? Liz mentioned we're having this discussion in this country around reindustrialization. How do we reshore certain manufacturing entities that we've lost over time? We're going to need to retrain people. We're going to need to make manufacturing facilities that are smarter. This technology can help all of those problem statements, right? And so I think we need to expand the aperture, right? Evolve the conversation a little bit on AI to what are people actually going to use it for and how are they going to use it? And then we leverage that to shine a light on this discussion as an initial step.
Yeah. It is an initial step. It's also notable, we had Congressman Liu at the top. He's been very engaged in discussions around artificial intelligence. And as he mentioned, he also serves on the Reality Caucus, which is members of Congress that have a shared interest in immersive technologies. So those are the types of members that we need to make sure we're engaging and helping us to carry these conversations forward. Jeremy, during our preparation for this call, you made a really nice observation about the track record that government plays and how it can be a constructive force in these types of discussions. I think you mentioned the E-rate program as an example, and I love that. And that seeks to help schools and other such institutions get access to telecommunications and internet through a charge that is assigned for that. I was wondering, what are specific areas where the federal government can act as a catalyst for XR adoption as you think about the people that you work with?
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, E-rate is such a good example because the idea behind it was to bring broadband, right? To make sure that all education institutions had equitable access, right, to technology. And so we're really talking about the same thing right now, and in an era that is moving insanely fast, and AI is taking over the conversation. Going back to XR being the foundational piece that is allowing us to interact with that, the government has to step in right now and create some form of strategy. They have to put in some form of funding, and they have to ensure that we are giving equitable access to one of the things that is a huge asset of our nation, and that is our people, right? And the more people that have access to this have more opportunity to build and to keep us at the forefront of things. And just a few minutes ago, before we came on stage, Kristi made a really great point, and she said, policy's going to happen, right? Policy's going to happen. You said this. But are we going to help shape it? Is industry going to be a part of that conversation, right? Or is the XRA's leadership in Immersive Technology Act going to be passed and to be a part of this? Or is some senator going to see their kid buy a headset, right, as you said, and they're going to create policy for us without allowing us to be part of that conversation? And 10 minutes before we had that conversation, the XRA, I got your guys' email this morning, posted a new stat. 1 in 5 teenagers now, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it's 1 in 5 teenagers in the US now has a headset, right?
Yeah.
That is a huge new stat, and when you think about that from a policy perspective, we're very close to a senator doing exactly what Kristi mentioned, instead of making sure that our nation all has equitable access. And let's take that a step further. XR is incredible for anybody who is remote. I mean, you want to talk about Alaska or Wyoming or anybody who doesn't have access to all kinds of the same technologies, ensuring that all of those folks have access to this technology, that's what we need to see from our government.
Well, and the other interesting stat as the form factor is changing is that the Ray-Ban, the smart Ray-Bans, Meta Ray-Bans, they outsell regular Ray-Bans in 60% of the markets, right? So
it's phenomenal.
Right. So the form factor is coming, and I think to your point, when you were talking about the first AI thinking around policy happened out of fear, right? Yeah. Who's making these models? What's in there? How are we? Right.
Yep.
And this senator who has a kid, this imaginary senator who has a kid,
he's not so imaginary,
who's going to start writing policy, they're going to do it out of fear. Oh, my kid is accessing this or doing that. And all of a sudden everything clamps down, which is not good for innovation, because the other kinds of clients that BCG serves is clients that are actually in these industries, inventing new things, figuring out new uses. And my clients certainly don't want someone who is less than fully informed about both the risks and the opportunities to begin to put legislation around the ways that they can innovate and experiment.
Yeah, and maybe a way to sort of fill out this conversation is to reverse engineer our situation, right? Let's say that the US leadership for Immersive Technology Act passes, and we are able to bring together industry, academia, government, and others to have a truly strategic conversation about where this technology should go. Where does it go? Andres, what's the meaning behind that, do you think?
Well, it would be a really critical first step,
Yeah.
right? But it would just be a first step. I think we can look at what's happening right now in the AI space for a roadmap for, I think, what we would need in the XR space once we take this initial step, right? So the last administration put out an AI action plan. The current administration is in the process of putting out an AI action plan. How did they do it? They put out a request for comments. There was a comment period. Industry submitted comments. They're in the process of reviewing that. And at some point later this summer, they're going to unveil a national AI action plan. And it's going to be focused on how do we maintain US leadership in AI, what are the regulatory obstacles, if any, that need to be addressed, what are the different agencies going to be charged with doing to promote AI in the different industries that they cover. We need something similar for XR technology. A couple months later, about a month ago, the National Science Foundation put out another request for input, saying, hey, we want industry's input on what a national AI R&D strategic plan should look like. So a roadmap, national AI action plan, and then separately, what should we focus on from an R&D perspective? Where can government provide unique value in areas that maybe industry is not focused on? And again, deliberative process, consultative process. They're in the process of reviewing that. And then they're going to put out a strategic plan for R&D specifically focused on AI. We need something similar to that for XR, some sort of national deployment plan, if you will. And this type of thing has worked. It's not unusual. If you look at autonomous vehicles, for example, right? There's been different efforts on a national AV framework. There's different technologies where when the government comes in and says, this is strategic, this is important, let's consult with industry, and let's put out a roadmap together in a public-private partnership that lays out what the benchmarks are, what the targets are, and it goes back to the old adage, what gets measured gets done, right? And it puts that, that plants that flag from a government perspective that this is a priority. It signals to industry that this is a priority. It helps alleviate the concern that you raised, Kristi, in terms of the U.S. being a little bit unique because certain folks are a little bit reticent to pursue maybe certain use cases because they're not sure what that regulatory landscape looks like. With this initial step, we can identify what those regulatory obstacles are or where we may need regulation to provide additional clarity and be, I think, on a much more coordinated path, again, in tandem, private sector and public sector, towards a roadmap for success.
Yeah. And it's interesting, if you look at what Europe's doing, they're very focused on industrial use of XR. They're investing in that. And here we are talking about trying to bring back our industrial base. They have such a well-planned approach. Now, apples and oranges, right, in terms of the level of regulation, the role that industry plays in all of that. But they're moving. We need to move with equal vigor, really. And that, Andres, I did want to just come back to you because there's often this conversation about that balance between public and private, and and you guys can all weigh in, but maybe start with Andres a little bit.
Yeah, I think that this is obviously a call for action from the government, but if you follow government at all, you know that government moves very slowly. You know that government and regulation can never keep up with the pace of innovation, and so in terms of finding that right balance, we have to be communicating with our government stakeholders around what we need and the role that they can play, but we can't rely on them exclusively, and we don't in this country is the good news, right? We've got this incredible culture of innovation. I think with new technologies, I think there's a long history of industry coming together and doing really important standardization and benchmarking work. The XR Association has shown tremendous leadership on that front. So I think as industry, we can't just, even though this discussion is focused around policy and what the government needs to do to help us, ultimately it's on us. Continue having those discussions with the government, continue pushing them, but don't wait for them and don't let their inaction thus far slow down the pace of what we're doing. We just need to continue to educate them about the importance of this technology and sort of keep moving the ball down the field, so to speak.
Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say the other thing to think about, and I'll tell another BCG client story. We probably 5 years ago, before a lot of the facial recognition policies came together, one of the big tech companies approached us and asked us to put together, in some ways, a straw man, right? Because a bunch of states had passed legislation requiring conspicuous notice and consent for facial recognition that was to be used for non-security purposes, so for payment, for instance. Their retail clients that they were trying to sell this technology to weren't buying because they could see, I mean, and nobody had defined, like, what does conspicuous notice and consent mean? Like, do I put like a Post-it note on the front door of the store saying warning? I mean, like, and this is my point about looking for the safe harbor. And so we helped them put together a kind of a straw man set of guidelines. And so in some ways, industry is gonna have to move. Yep. We need the governmental support. We need the government to come along with us, but sometimes they're not moving fast enough for the developments that we're seeing, and we have to do things like that.
Yeah, and not to toot our own horn, but that's the role of an industry trade association, is to bring all of our disparate voices within the industry to address a common challenge or a common issue and come up with that best standard. Not the bottom, but what works and is comprehensive and provides a sense of certainty and understanding to those that want to come and invest in our country around these technologies. So yeah.
I think on taking that even one step further is it's not just about talking to our government and telling them how and why they should support us. It's about giving them sound bites. They don't know what this is, right? And so we've talked a lot today about how XR is the interface of AI, right? And so AI is such a hot topic. It's really amazing to blend these two things together. I think that's a wonderful soundbite that the government can latch onto and take. But at the same time, XR is its own thing. And XR is really interesting because it works on both sides. So while it will be the interface and the way that we experience AI, everyone who is displaced from their job because of AI is going to use XR to get retrained to do something else, right? And so we have this technology here that everybody's talking about AI and all of the things it's going to change, and yet here is a technology that's been in our laps for even longer and been in the news and the media for a longer period of time that plays both sides of the fence. And our government isn't talking about it at all anymore. Yeah. And so, taking that step and getting them to create policy is wildly important.
Well, and, in addition to the U.S. Leadership Act that we've talked about today, there are other efforts out there. Last year, I think there were 25 different pieces of legislation, whether it was appropriations or authorization language. And really what we're talking about is just getting a more deliberate approach. So as we wrap up our conversation here, I want to think a little bit about, what do you have to say to this audience who are manufacturers and creators and software developers and enthusiasts, like this whole community? How does everybody get involved and take a role in supporting the strategic bill and being a source of education for members of Congress and other government officials? So maybe we'll just go right down the line.
Yeah, well, I'll start and say, join the XRA. And even if you don't, like, I know that, and I think you're even going to put it up for everyone, there's an opportunity for you to have a voice within the government. There it is.
That's our call to action, folks. Those are letters that you can send to your member of Congress to support the U.S. leadership bill. So we would really love it if each of you get on and
I will back that up and say we just became members of the XRA, within the last year, and the first month that we did so, we had the opportunity to go to DC, and our company got to sit in front of. The XRA put together 4 meetings with 4 different Senate offices for us. We reached out to the others ourselves while we were out there and set up our own meetings. And it was much easier than I had expected that to be, to actually walk into a senator or a representative's office and tell them what was going on, what we were working on. But if we aren't going to be that voice as an industry who's reaching out to them, telling them what they need to fund, how they can be funding it, what's important, safety regulations, that needs to come from our voices, or it's going to be our imaginary senator we've been talking about who's going to be creating that policy. So even if you don't join the XR Association today, like, send one of these.
How much are you paying him?
I know. I was about to say, I did not give him any money, I promise. So.
No, but it's
Well,
true.
I think maybe I'll take a different tack, which is to speak to all the developers and builders out there. Understand that as the thing that you've made rolls out in the world and gets picked up by whatever big company is gonna give you scale or whatever, or maybe you're with a big company, to really begin to think about, like, if part of this build, if I had to develop policy around, like, how to, like, of course it's my company, I want to win, it's exciting. And it's very funny that I'm talking about this because I'm a natural optimist. But think about the risk. Like, where are the privacy and ethics concerns? Where are the risks? What kinds of policies would we need to have in place that would balance that kind of, like, I need to take care of individuals in their using of this technology, but I also need to make space for innovation.
So I'll give you a very tangible thing, which is educate your policymakers about what you're doing, right? So effective advocacy is simply just storytelling, telling a compelling story. You don't have to be in Washington, D.C. We'd love to have you, but you don't have to come to Washington, D.C. to engage in the policymaking process, right? If you're a U.S.-based company anywhere in the U.S., you have a local member of Congress that has a local office. Invite them to your facility. Go to their office, bring a demo, tell them the story. This is what we're doing, and this is what we're using this technology for. This is how it's going to transform this industry. This is how it's going to transform healthcare, education. Tell your story. It's very simple, right? The easiest thing in the world is to talk about what you do every day. We started out this event with an intro from Representative Ted Lieu. I believe currently he's one of 3 members of Congress that have a computer science background, right? Of over 500 members of Congress. There's only 3, maybe there's 4 now, right? But one hand, right? So these folks they don't understand technology the way that you do, and they love not just hearing the stories, but actually experiencing the technology. It's one thing to talk about XR and embedded and augmented, but it's another thing to just say, here, put this on, watch this, right, and experience it firsthand. So if you're in a position to do that locally, you would be surprised how beneficial that could be to driving this conversation forward.
And if you do that, we'd love to hear about it so that we can build off of all of your great efforts. But hopefully what you take away from this conversation today is now is the time to build this strategic framework for our industry. This is the moment to start pushing it ahead, and there are several steps then that will follow to really make this a strong industry, one where policymakers are educated, they're making rational decisions about what the future of XR enabled with AI is going to look like for workforce retraining, for education, upskilling, medicine, healthcare, all of the rest. And that's the power of our technology. You have a voice, and hopefully you go out and use it, because that's the most powerful way to make change for all of us. So I want to thank the panelists. I think this was a great conversation and really appreciate it. So
Thank you.
Yeah.